Now we've got our final panel now, and I'll introduce each of our panellists one by one and ask them to come and join me on the podium. First one is Dr David Kemp, and it always feels a bit strange welcoming a Kemp to an IPA function, given the Kemp family's long history in the IPA. David probably needs little introduction to most of you. David's one of those rare people in Australia who's combined being both an academic and a practicing politician. So somebody who has clearly thought a lot about political ideas, historical ideas, and then brought that into practice in his parliamentary career, 14 years in the federal parliament, including several years as a minister, including for education, which saw him be part of perhaps the target of the demonstrators who tried to join us a bit earlier on. So David, welcome to the stage. Our second panellist is Dr. Greg Melleuish, currently of the University of Wollongong. Greg's worked at a number of Australian universities, and I think he just needs to be congratulated for his courage as being practising in history departments around Australia when his views are probably not entirely in sync with many of his colleagues that he's worked with over the years. Greg, one thing that Greg has as a particular specialty is the study of the history of Australian liberalism, and it's a topic which too often has been written by the opponents of liberalism in Australia, and Greg, I think, has drawn out, particularly in some of his work and a number of the books that he's written about the early history of liberalism in Australia and how there were a number of different strands, not just the one that has tended to be written about by others, such as Stuart McIntyre. And our third panellist is Tim Wilson. And I think everybody in the room would probably say, Tim, would you like to come up, please? Tim is very, I think, known to everybody. I think we all know the value that Tim, I think, spent about 6 or 7 years at the IPA, and I think we can judge the value of what Tim achieved at the IPA by the reaction that he got when he was then appointed to the Human Rights Commission. The horror that his appointment drew, I think, he no doubt should have and no doubt did wear as a badge of honour. So congratulations for that, Tim.
Thank you.
Now, the purpose of this panel is really to talk about, I suppose, to finish on perhaps a brighter note by talking about the future of liberty and democracy in Australia, the theme that we've had today. And we've got people particularly who bring a historical perspective to the study of the topic of liberty, liberalism, democracy, but to try and get them to draw on some of those past experiences to see how we are placed today compared to perhaps how we've been in the past. So we in a better situation today, a worse situation today, just to reflect on some of those sorts of topics. And as with the other panels that we've conducted, we'll have about short opening statements from each of our panellists, then a little bit of interactive discussion on the panel, and then we'll throw it open to questions again. So, David, would you like to kick us off with a few comments, please? I should say about David too, some of you in the audience may have seen him deliver the Alfred Deakin lecture on Tuesday night at Melbourne University, and it was a wonderful lecture on perhaps some of the themes we're going to touch on today. So David's probably got the terrible challenge of trying to turn a lecture was probably about a 50-minute lecture into about a 3-minute summation now, David, so see how you go.
Well, following on from Ian Callanan, I just wanted to reassure you that I was just slightly more than half qualified to be a minister. I have seen all the episodes of Yes Minister, and I've watched a great many Gilbert and Sullivan operas, but I haven't sat an exam on any of them. This has certainly been a remarkable seminar, and it's hard to know, I suppose, at this time of the day, whether one should feel distressed by the magnitude of the problems that the lovers of liberty face, or whether one should be inspired by the enthusiasm of those who are here today, and it's a great tribute to the IPA. I'm going to finish on an optimistic note. The future of liberty is bright. And it's bright because of politics. Now that will astonish you because the word hasn't been mentioned, I think, today. But if you think back, although Liberals tend to think, and probably rightly so, that government is mainly the enemy, all the great advances in liberty that have been mentioned today, and I suppose I could argue with Claudio on the common law, whether it's part of this set of examples, but all the great advances in liberty have been decisions by government to step back and secure rights. And governments don't act without politics. And if we're really interested in making sure that the future of liberty in Australia is bright, then the answer is ultimately going to have to lie in politics. And I believe it's bright because our politics secures a political process that forces our politicians over time to act in a way which is favourable to liberty rather than the reverse. Politicians respond to the electorate. And I believe that liberty is pushed ahead by the most powerful force in politics, and that is the desire of individual people to control their own lives and to pursue happiness. And politicians in the end respond to that desire. Now, the problem that politicians have is that the people who have that desire also have another desire, and that is to control and influence the people around them, to leave them alone, or to do the things that they think will add to their standard of living, their quality of life. And of course, as Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out 180 years ago, as governments respond to this desire of people to control others and get others to adopt their opinions, the sphere of central government insensibly grows, even though every individual person would like to restrict it. And hence, de Tocqueville feared that there would be a democratic despotism. Yet I think there's another force working, which was pointed out by our earlier speakers, that comes out of the Enlightenment and which is going to save us. And that is reason. We learn from our mistakes. And I'm confident that we do learn from our mistakes because we have learnt from our mistakes. By 1930, Australia had one of the largest government sectors in the whole Western world, probably the largest. Amongst the things that it did was to plunge into protectionism, which destroyed jobs, destroyed the export capacity of Australia's industry, created massive inefficiency, was politically impossible to stop spreading throughout the entire economy, and when commodity prices fell, gave us the highest unemployment, one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. And of course, there was a country to our north that decided it would have to use its armies to open up the markets that were closed to us, and Japan started to attack every country between here and there and finally bombed Australia. Now, that was a massive policy failure, but we learnt from it. There's scarcely a democratic politician today who doesn't think that free trade is the correct policy for governments to pursue. Now, the person who pointed out that if government stepped back and allowed people to trade, everyone would be better off was Adam Smith. And Adam Smith also said that this applied in the social sphere as well, that if we allowed people to deal with each other and not interfered with their lives by laws, a moral culture would grow up. Now, we haven't learnt quite as well in the social sphere as we have in the economic sphere Adam Smith's very profound insight. And so, of course, we have people who want to take away our liberty to say what we like, to impose all sorts of restrictions and tribunals on us, and to punish us if we step out of line. But when you hear a commissioner, not the one here of the Human Rights Commission, saying that if we didn't have 18C, the dark side of our nature would be unleashed, it's obvious that they've never contemplated the possibility that freedom actually produces a moral order. And that's the reason why I think Australia is the least racist country of all. So the character of Australians, as Nick Cater said, the fact that we learn from our mistakes, The fact that we have a political process that allows us to correct those mistakes gives me the confidence that we will ultimately find out that freedom works and government intervention, except in the limited spheres that Adam Smith pointed out, does not work. And what gives me final confidence is the fact that there are bodies in Australia like the IPA with a growing army of supporters who will get on the phone to their politicians and tell them where the interests of their electors truly lie.
Thank you very much, David. Greg, would you like to share some thoughts with us?
I'd like to provide two quotes. The first is from an article in the Empire in 1860 discussing J.S. Mill's recently published On Liberty. And the second is from the recently published Commission of Audit. Now, it's interesting, when Mill's On Liberty came out, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Argus, and the Empire, I haven't checked the age, all had leading articles on it. I'm trying to imagine something comparable to that today. So the article from the Empire, which was a very liberal journal. Liberty, it says, the subject will never grow old. The name will never cease to arouse the warmest, deepest feelings of man's heart. Momentary disgust at maudlin eulogies dedicated to this noble word, passing indignation at the crimes committed in the name of liberty, may occasionally throw a cloud over the glorious motto, but still will liberty be among the mightiest banner cries which nerve the brave and true to deeds of excellence. So that's 1860. Last week in the Commission of Audit, in a fascinating little section at the beginning about the role of government, Australians look to their governments to reduce the overall risk in society. Many look further, wanting governments to either solve all of society's risks or protect them from the inherent risks of everyday life. In fact, one looks in vain for words like liberty and individual in the Commission of Audit, but one finds endless mention of efficiency. So how do we get from the liberty of 1860 to the risk aversion of today? Well, the 1860 article suggests a possible reason for the current state of affairs. It says, talking about the 19th century, we are inclined to view this age as peculiarly the era of individualism. In past, as compulsory and hollow unities have characterised the word of mind. In the future, there will be a unity arising out of free, unprejudiced research and universal acknowledgement of truth. In the present, the human mind, having shaken off many of the trammels of mere prescription, not having reached the elevation of clear vision to which patient, honest and laborious investigation leads, exhibits the marvellous vagaries of individualism which are characteristic of a transition state. Now, when I read this, I thought, today that might be interpreted as meaning once the science is settled, there's no need for individual liberty. Still, the 19th century was the great age of individual liberty. I think of myself as a bit of a 19th century liberal. It was also the age of voluntary associations, as individuals willingly came together to solve problems and deal with risk themselves. So how did we get from an age of liberty to one of risk avoidance and reliance on the state? Well, one answer is the inexorable growth of the state in the 20th century. But the other, I think, very important, which hasn't been mentioned today, is the growth of a culture which provides the highest level of comfort in human history. The state seduces us by kindness, by looking after us. This is called social justice. We seek to avoid risk because it might destroy the comfort which envelops our lives. Deeds of excellence require one to take risks, but in taking risks, we must sacrifice the possibility of comfort. The competitive ancient Greeks took great risks and they achieved great things for this reason. The Commission of Audit indicates that Australia, like other Western countries, places too many burdens on the state in the name of avoiding risk and in allowing individuals to pursue comfort. Its solution to prudent management is in the name of efficiency. But that is not the road to individual liberty or to deeds of excellence. So the real question for Australia in the future is it possible to wean individuals over what Paddy McGuinness used to call the tit of the state? It's like asking, do you prefer uncertainty and a more difficult life to one of settled comfort? For me, it's difficult to see how the members of a comfort-addicted society will opt for taking more responsibilities for their lives. Perhaps we will have to wait for the collapse of the overburdened state for that to happen.
Thank you very much, Greg, for that. Now, Tim, you've got two hard acts.
I'm the optimist.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Tim, you've got two hard acts to follow there, so let's hear what your...
Incredibly hard acts to follow, Richard, but I think I'm going to echo more of David's sentiments than Greg's, because I am an eternal optimist. I might just give some brief reflections in light of my new role and how that fits into the future of freedom. I am a great optimist because when you look at the relationship, or the underpinnings of liberty being about the relationship between particularly the individual and the state, all I see are hallmarks of increased power, empowerment of the individual versus the state. The state has some more power as well, but the relationship difference between is much more in favour of the individual overall. The future of freedom to me very much lies in keeping things outside of government and outside of the law. And I think the debate around Section 18C, the Racial Discrimination Act, is a perfect example of this, where we have to keep power both with individuals, but we also must foster individuals to take that power and to exercise that degree of responsibility, because in the end, laws and government will only crowd them out from doing so. In essence, people need to be able to have responsibility in order to be able to exercise responsibility in the same way that applies with how they choose then to exercise their freedoms so that they can do it successfully. And that really comes back down to all of us in the room, but also the institutions of freedom outside of government, to boost an understanding and an awareness of how we do that. I think one of the things that's been most depressing around recent discussion has been how people have equated unacceptability with what should be unlawful, rather than looking about the huge number of institutions, social norms, social pressure that exists around voluntarily regulating conduct without the use of law, which establishes how we go about our lives in a voluntary capacity while also having means of recourse when we think people have stepped out of line. And whether that's through people exercising their free association to associate with people they agree or disagree with, and to use that as a mechanism to punish people if they think people have overstepped the line, that's very important. And I think that's where I probably disagree with some of the commentators who have made sentiments this morning about social movements or academic focuses that they disagree with. So long as it is done in a voluntary sense and done in a way that challenges and provokes society, even if it is wrong-headed, reason can overcome the consequences of that and reassert why our country, why our society is heading in the right direction in preserving liberty and making sure that we address the challenges we face as a society, because we are not at the end of history. We need to recognise that there is much more that can be done to improve our society, but to maintain liberty concurrently. And I was aware of that recently. I gave a speech at an Australia Day Council event around Australia Day, and people were complaining about the fact that the standard problems within our society that people complain about regularly on the ABC and other taxpayer-funded forms of media. And the standard response from a panel like this from most people who I'd say were probably of a more left persuasion than myself was of the reminder of, oh yes, this is the problems with our society, this is just a reinforcement of everything that's wrong and why the government needs to do more. And my response was the reverse, which is actually we need to remind ourselves that this is how far we have come. that now we are no longer focusing on day to day on whether children are being born and living in poverty, and we are focusing on much more important issues about how we do deal with issues of justice within a free society. We just need to make sure that we don't throw our baby out with the bathwater. But equally, I think we need to be making sure that we're approaching it in a positive and optimistic light. Liberals, Conservatives, whatever anybody wants to call themselves, have a great story to tell about what we can do and what we have done in the past to preserve and promote liberty while also dealing with injustices in the community. And one of the things I'm most wary of is particularly people who identify as Conservatives establishing themselves as victims in current debate and thinking that that is a problem, rather than seeing the way they approach these debates in looking in a much more optimistic light.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to raise with all three of you is the interaction of, I suppose, economic liberty with social liberty, and whether improvements in one area necessarily go with the other. I'm thinking particularly so of the period of the 1980s, when there was significant progress in, I suppose, promoting economic liberty by destroying some of those factors that David referred to, what Australia had become like by 1930, dismantling what Paul Kelly called the Australian settlement. But at the same time that government was doing some things which probably a lot of people in this room would think were good things, in freeing up the Australian economy, opening it up to more foreign competition, reducing protection, it was also doing a lot of things in the social sphere that were probably limiting liberty. Things like setting up the Human Rights Commission and passing racial discrimination acts with Section 18C in them.
That was before the 80s, by the way.
Yeah, so the racial, yes, and then things, 70s and things, but there was a lot more happened of that sort of thing in the 80s and into the 90s with the Labash amendments to the Discrimination Act. How do you see that those things tend to go together in history and are likely to go together as we look forward to the future, or can they operate completely independently? We can make progress in one area and not the other. Who would like to comment on that?
Well, I'd like to think we could make progress in both. Simultaneously. That's the aim, isn't it? If we want to establish a society based on liberty, then we're talking about economic liberty and social liberty. And I don't see any necessary interaction between them. I think there are separate forces at work. I think by the 1980s we were a great deal better educated about the value of economic liberty than we were about the value of social liberty. And I think we still struggle with the question of social liberty and how much liberty is desirable and what will be the consequences of liberty, and will our society and our institutions survive if we're free. Now that's the sort of debate that there's always been about liberty. It's the historic debate about liberty. It was the debate that Conservatives used to oppose economic liberty back in the 19th century. But what will finally determine the outcome, I think, is ultimately what the people, the electors, perceive will work. And we finally learnt that all our utopian hopes of producing a more humane society by putting judges in the middle of the workplace and compulsory arbitration and the state encouragement of trade unionism and the support for closed shops and the regulation of hours of work and wages and so forth, all of this we learnt didn't ultimately achieve the objectives that we wanted. We found we were more prosperous if we allowed people to get on with their jobs and to establish enterprises and be rewarded for them. And once we learnt that fact, admittedly it took the Second World War to really teach us that we had to do better than we had in the past, and it certainly took a revolution in our politics with the establishment of political parties. And this was Robert Menzies' attempt, was to establish a political party that was not dependent on interests. I mean, he believed that all the parties that he'd had to work in from the time he entered politics in 1927 were dominated by interests. They were either business interests or church interests. His effort was to establish in 1944 a party that wasn't dominated by interests, and then he could decide matters on the basis of philosophy and principle, that politics and government should be by principle, not pressure. And one can make your own assessment about how well he achieved that, but it was a revolutionary thought in the organisation of our political life. Now, in terms of social interventions, the question ultimately will be, do they work? And of course, we've got one of the greatest liberals in Australia at the moment, I think, advocating the case for liberty is Noel Pearson, because he and his colleagues in Indigenous education have observed that welfare poison destroys communities and it leads to abuse and it actually destroys lives. And his message to Tony Abbott and the government is step back. Let us take some personal responsibility for our own lives and our own communities, and then we'll solve some of these problems. And what he's really saying is liberty will solve them and government won't. And there are a number of areas of our community life where people are, I think, increasingly perceiving that that's the case. And Australia, let me just finish on this, Australia, I think, is a remarkable country precisely for the reasons that Nick Cater mentioned. Because we're a nation of immigrants, we don't have all the problems and distractions that the old world countries have. We can focus on our main task, which is getting on with our own lives and controlling our own lives and bringing up our families. And we can ask government to do that for us. And I think Australians are more likely to do that than almost anywhere else in the world.
Thanks, David. Either Greg or Tim, would you like to comment on that?
As I said in my little presentation, I think one of the bugbears of Australian life is a tendency to confuse liberty with efficiency, when in fact the two are not the same. So if we go back to the 1980s and the Hawke-Keating reforms, what we forget is that those reforms were meant to create more wealth so they could build a bigger welfare state. You know, it wasn't about liberty it wasn't about reforms for the sake of liberty, it was about reforms for the sake of the welfare state. And when it comes to liberty, it's curious. People can be liberal and want liberty in some areas and not want liberty in others. I was thinking what came to my mind was the 19th century writer and politician Bernard Wise, who was one of the great advocates of free trade. But when it came to internal politics, he was a great advocate of arbitration and basically social liberalism. I mean, people are full of contradictions in this regard. You know, this is unfortunately in the real world, because we have liberals and we have conservatives. Some people are going to want liberty in some areas, and they may want restraints in others. But that's just the fact we're contradictory, and we have to live with that.
Tim?
Richard, I'd just say there is a correlation between economic and sort of social liberty, but I'd argue it's probably mostly in the reverse direction. So if you want to control the economy, you end up controlling social liberty because you can't control the economy without controlling people. But I wouldn't say it was in the reverse, though I see optimistic signs. And drawing again from recent experience, after some people got past the sort of shock and awe of me being appointed to my new role, I've gone through the process, and I don't want to verbal anybody in the process of doing so, of speaking to various people in the different other human rights bodies, state agencies, anti-discrimination bodies. And one of the consistent themes I've run is, and I'm sure most people in this room will appreciate it, is at the end of my tenure, one of the last things, or one of the key objectives I have, is that there will not be one single new law as a consequence of my term. At which first everybody is shocked, because they cannot understand why I would not, one, want to use it as a hallmark to stamp my name on it, but also that they see that law is very much an instrument to advance social objectives. And I explain my reasoning and why I don't think it is. And in fact, what I would rather see is more individuals taking responsibility, but that things like culture and social norms play, I would argue, a more important role, not just in the macro framework, but also in the day-to-day lives in terms of advancing the ideas of rights, respect, and respect for others. And at first, I got a lot of pushback. And what I have found since is more and more people conceding that actually that is what is necessary to make Australia a better country.
Good. Good. Thank you. Right. We might open it up now to questions from the floor. Did anybody have any questions out there? Forest of hands going up. Dom's got a microphone there that he's going to give to somebody. So whoever Dom gives the microphone to, you can ask the first question. So, right here, thank you.
Hi, I wanted to ask the panel what they think is perhaps driving the interest in liberty and the ideas that we've been talking about today. There's evidence. I mean, we've got, even just looking at the IPA's annual report last year, there's a big uptick in membership. We've got people like Chris Berg on TV shows quite a bit. They're getting asked to go on a lot. And what do you think? Where do you think that is coming from?
I think it comes from ordinary citizens not wanting to be pushed around by governments, not having everything regulated for them. People like to have their sphere of competence where they can do what they think is best for themselves and not being constantly told by the state what is in their best interest. So I think, you know, it's a cumulative effect over the years. You know, the state gets itself into more and more and more little facets of our lives.
Can I say I agree with that, except I would only say that there's a relationship between the two, which is the bigger the state, the more, we use that Mark Stein example, you know, a big state means small citizens, and that in response, citizens respond in kind by saying the state may need to be curtailed or needs to be curtailed. But there's a clear relationship between the two of them, and then a movement builds as a consequence from it, which has a certain degree of momentum, and that's where you can't underestimate the enormous contribution of organisations like the IPA, but I think particularly the IPA, in getting out there, because the more people are told it is acceptable to appeal to their most basic instinct that they have a right to live their own lives, the more it becomes self-reinforcing to make a further pushback. And so much of the work that people in the IPA do is actually about giving them an idea that in the mainstream that their opinion has validity because other people share it as well, which only seeks them to then go and reinforce it, to build a movement, to build an idea about how society should be governed.
Thanks for that. Yeah, sorry, Doug. Yeah.
I think in the short term it's clearly a result of the establishment of various think tanks like the Centre of Independent Studies and the IPA and the revival of liberalism after the Second World War by the Mont Pelerin Society and liberal economists like Hayek and Friedman. I mean, I think there's no doubt that our culture began to focus much more on liberty. But I would secondly say that I think that Australia has got a remarkable capacity to throw up such liberal circles, as I call them. If you go back and look at the 19th century, there were such liberal circles then. Groups that were advocating free trade were basically think tanks, making the case like the IPA, distributing literature, putting it in journals, sending people into politics. And that's because Australia was established in the Great Liberal Age, the 19th century post-Enlightenment. There's something about the creative capacity of our society to throw up organised defenders of liberty that I think has constantly kept this issue in front of us. And the third thing I would say is that I think this is simply an outcome at an intellectual level of something much more fundamental, which you can observe right through history, which is that people fundamentally want to control their own lives. They want to be secure, to plan their lives and to live their lives as they want to set their own missions in life. And they have to make difficult choices. They will. I mean, they'll prefer security over the freedom of their neighbours if they don't trust their neighbours. But we're very lucky that we live in an age, and this is where I think the lucky country is right, but it's the lucky world in a sense. We live in an age when we understand more about the institutions that are necessary to secure liberty. But I think, above all, we're fortunate that we live in a country which constantly seems to give birth to these kinds of pro-liberty organisations. There's something about Australia and its immigrant culture.
Right. We'll take a question from over this side now. Yeah, maybe down here. We've got one. Sarah's just coming down with a microphone. Wolfgang?
Thank you. Wolfgang Kasper is my name. I share this opinion here that liberty is on the winning side, that things have become better and will become better. However, this is never a straight line thing. There are zigs and zags, and I think the Australian democracy is in for another downward zag, and that is that referendum to create different classes of Australians. In other words, to violate that very basic principle of equality of all citizens before the law, which, for example, in the words of the French Constitution of 1789, was one of the three big principles. Liberty. No, fraternité came later. It was propriété, property rights, secure property rights, essential for economic freedom. But are we really likely to, as a people, to violate, through a preamble in the Constitution, equality before the law? I'm probably more sensitive to this than most others. I've worked in Malaysia, Fiji, and other countries that had affirmative action on racial grounds. It's always hurt the people who it was to favor. That's one argument. And it's always corrupted. Politics has always corrupted and hurt liberty. Does the panel think that the outcome of that referendum, because the two major parties support it, will be in favor, a yes vote? Thank you.
Who wants to have a go at that one?
I'll have a first stab at that one. There are two components to that. There's the recognition of Indigenous people in the Australian Constitution as a broad proposition. Then there's what's actually proposed in the end. And there was the inquiry led by Brennan, which came to recommendations, which were 4 principles. I'm now just testing my memory about what 4 of them were. One of them was recognition. One of them was to take out the race powers. One was to insert a new power for the government to be able to legislate to advance the interests of Indigenous Australians. And one was a non-discrimination power. I think the last two are dead in the water before they start. The second one has the capacity to be passed because it seeks to unite us as a country rather than divide us. And then the very first one, that's removing the government's capacity to make powers based on people's race. I think that can unite us. And then the first one, I should say, is the one about recognition in the Constitution. Now, depending on how that's done, basically comes down to whether it's going to go ahead, whether it's going to pass or not. But I have to say, I actually have a lot of faith in many people in the Indigenous communities about this, where firstly they don't want to see it go ahead unless they think it's going to be successful. They're also acutely aware of the fact the only way that it's going to be successful is if it unites the country and doesn't create the sorts of things that you just talked about. And in fact, what I've seen is a surprisingly large amount of pushback from people with Indigenous communities because they're worried that it won't achieve the first 2 objectives. And as a consequence, it might go down, and their view is it would then scar the country, rather than doing to the extent that they think it has any relevance. And I have to say that a lot of Indigenous people who think it has very little relevance because it doesn't actually deal with the problems that are being faced in remote communities and everywhere else, that it would have the complete reverse effect that's intended. So I am not as pessimistic about what may come out of it, but we'll only know depending on the extent and the breadth of the first proposal.
I often tell my students, in a few hundred years' time, pretty well every Australian will be Indigenous, given the rates of intermarriage. So it'll be meaningless in time, which is an interesting thought. So it's a product of. Problem is, it's the product of a politics of a particular period. Do we want to embed in our constitution something which is the product of a particular period? And I don't think we do. It's like putting, the Irish constitution used to have anti-abortion in it, I think, from memory. That's the things you don't put into constitutions. On the race power, I personally find it objectionable that the race power is in the Constitution to begin with. I don't think it should ever have been there. I don't think we should be asking our government and our judges to actually adjudicate on what race means, because no one knows what it means. You know, and so, of course, the irony is, of course, if they got rid of the race power, that means that the Commonwealth government couldn't have Aboriginal affairs, could it?
I've actually, I'll actually just quickly answer that, because I've had this discussion from within the Commission about it, and there is a view that through the external affairs power, through international treaties, that you would still actually be able to do that. But I'll just couch that by many of the people who would argue against if you take the race power and insert a new one about Indigenous Australians only, that the only way you would be able to do it is to rely on the external affairs power. And the question is, from your perspective, which would you consider to be the worst outcome?
David, did you
good answer.
Good. Another question over this side.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for the mic, Dom. Paul Collitz, conservative and pessimist. Want to slightly challenge the relentless optimism of the libertarians in the room. Friedrich Hayek has been mentioned wonderfully, and he wrote one of the more pessimistic books of modern times called The Road to Serfdom. And I think his argument was that people have to know that they're being slowly boiled frogs. And unlike Stalinism and Italian fascism and Nazism, Hayek was of the view that people would grow quite comfortable on what Paddy McGuinness apparently called the tit of the state. Fast forward to Mitt Romney, who unfortunately was caught on film in a candid moment in which he was talking about the 47%. That would provide, and his ultimate defeat electorally, which was actually linked strongly to that comment, might suggest that Hayek's pessimism, in my view, was well and truly warranted, and that comfort and security provide threats to freedom, which I believe will continue, and people almost don't notice them. A lot of people outside this room don't know there's a debate in Australia about freedom of the press.
Does an optimist want to respond or a pessimist?
David, do you want to go first?
Yes, I'll respond. Of course, Hayek ended the Constitution of Liberty with a famous chapter headed "Why I Am Not a Conservative." And of course, he published that book in 1960, some 16 years after he did The Road to Serfdom. And by then, he was talking about the tremendous creative powers of a free civilisation. In other words, I think he felt that in the intervening years that significant progress had been made that perhaps alleviated his pessimism expressed in The Road to Serfdom, because people had taken the message. It was well known to the IPA at the time. I know The Road to Serfdom influenced the IPA, which was established in 1942, and its early works reflected the thinking in The Road to Serfdom, and they were certainly influential on the formation of the Liberal Party. So I think that while you're right, that the frog often perhaps doesn't know that the water's about to boil, and that there are people who simply do not see the bigger forces moving around them and are not engaged in public debate, and they're getting on with their private lives. Australia, as I think we've seen, does tend to throw up people who are alert and who can take political action, and have done so. One of the interesting anecdotes about the IPA that's always fascinated me is when I looked at the history of the organisation. One of the founders was a man called Sir Walter Massey Green, and he lost his seat in Parliament because he introduced the very high tariffs of the early 1920s and was a Deaconite protectionist. By the time the IPA was publishing in the late 1940s, Massey Green had become a very strong defender of economic freedom and warning people against socialism and government intervention. And he's a very good example of how progress can be made.
Firstly, I just want to clarify, Paul, I consider myself to be a liberal, not a libertarian, and it's a subtle branding difference, but I think one of the biggest problems we have in this country is that in our circle is liberal is the best word we have And I'm always wary of people who are liberals identifying as conservatives or liberals identifying as libertarians, because there are plenty of people in Australian politics who don't represent those values but would love to take that term and to grab it for themselves and to use it and abuse it as they see fit to advance their aims, because liberalism does embody, to me, our best hopes, not only for ourselves as individuals but for us as a society generally. So I know it might sound like a tedious point of clarification, but I think it's an important one. But I guess with the frog example, we're always in the pot. Democracy is only the extent to which we turn the dial on how hot the water gets. And our challenge is always to make sure that it's a nice temperature that's warm and enables us to keep swimming around freely without turning it up too greatly. But I have great optimism about us being able to rein in the extent of the state, both in the social sphere, because, yes, you're right, there isn't a huge awareness among some groups of people about the fact we're having a debate about press freedom. But if you look at the debates around internet censorship under our former communications minister, Stephen Conroy, what you saw was a generational understanding of how serious that threat could be to their liberty. And that was fostered by groups like the IPA, who need to take a good share of the credit, but also of other organisations who weren't perhaps motivated by higher philosophical principles, but they were motivated out of self-interest and were actually prepared to stand up. And that's the benefit, and always has been, of having an enlarged, not just private sector in the business sense, but also enlarged private sector in the civil society sense. Equally, I think there's a lot of room for optimism in the economic sphere, because if you look at the discussions we're having around economics at the moment, particularly around social welfare, the cost of pensions, the cost of health care, the cost of aged care, and in comparison to what somebody perhaps of my generation is going through, where we are concurrently paying for the pension costs of a generation, two generations before us, while concurrently paying for our superannuation, etc. And that goes across pretty much every type of social welfare program there is. There's a pretty clear understanding of the unjust nature that these sorts of programs can deliver us, and why there's a necessity to actually pare it back and make sure there's a high degree of economic freedom and responsibility that goes with it.
Can I just, following from Tim about Liberal, those of you who don't know will be interested that in the National History Curriculum section under Progressive Movements of the 19th century, liberalism is conspicuous by its absence. It apparently wasn't a progressive movement of the 19th century. But coming back to, you were talking about Hayek, the road to serfdom, part of my thinking always on this is from another Second World War, much smaller piece of writing by John Anderson on the servile state, in which he argues that if people want freedom and liberty, then there has to be something to spur them on. And his concern was that if you don't have something to spur, human nature is such, if you don't have something to spur them on, then they'll happily accept their condition. Rationality and reason is all very well, but it may not be sufficient to encourage people to take things into their own hands.
Right. Thanks, Greg. I'm afraid we're probably going to have to wrap it up. I know there's more questions there, but we have run a little bit over time, so I don't want to keep people for too long from there having a drink outside. I'd like to thank our panellists from this final panel, David Kemp, Greg Melleuish and Tim Wilson. I think everybody would agree that was a fascinating discussion.